Right. Thank you, everyone. We just now go straight into the next session, which is clinical trials in Africa. And I'll hand over to the facilitators for this session. We are welcome.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much. I'm Delva Shamley, and I'll be facilitating this session. I want to quickly give you some background to the session. There will be this evening a stakeholder roundtable to discuss a business plan which aims to increase the number of clinical trials in Africa, and it aims to do this by increasing the number of clinical trials units. The plan aims to source funding to set up complete infrastructure for each of the clinical trials units to ensure that it is GCP ready. It also intends to provide support training for clinicians and all the clinical research team in the clinical trials unit. It will not only train them, but also provide mentoring as they proceed with their first few clinical trials. Critically, it's going to be providing a strong quality management system. And for this, there will be operational processes defined, SOPs provided, budget templates, CTOs, lots of templates, homogenized quality management system. It then aims to accredit clinical trials units and to ensure ongoing quality management systems by auditing them annually. So this is the plan that is being put forward this evening. What I would like the aim of this session to be is for us to emerge with strong recommendations and action points to take forward to this evening's meeting. There will be two presentations and then a panel discussion with some lovely and super important people. So let's start with the two presentations. There will be no question and answer session, just information for our hosts. So the first speaker is Professor James Batchelor. He wears many hats, but I'll give you one today. He is Associate Dean for International Research and Enterprise at Southampton University in the UK. James, can you proceed, please? Just to say, he is having a bit of problems with his internet, so he may not be in video, but you will hear him.
So thank you, Delva, for inviting me to talk and giving me such a big topic to discuss in such a short period of time. But I'm just going to try and step through some of my experience of digital and data platforms in Africa in clinical trials, and to try and set a scene about what the opportunities of those are. But I want to just kind of pepper this with some probably more generic things. So this is a statement that was in a review of the opportunities of using digital in clinical trials, actually about 10 years ago, actually now, which describes that roughly only about 15% of the world's population is in Africa, but only 0.9% of that of global clinical trials historically are being conducted there. And this shows that there's been a sort of a lack of infrastructure investment over a period of time. But what the report actually points to, which I think is really interesting because it's focusing on digital, is the digital capacity. And the opportunity that actually lies in not only Africa, but actually across a number of different other continents where there's an opportunity for actually digital capacity to leapfrog other parts of the world. And I want to sort of touch a little bit on that as we talk through this. So the development of electronic data capture globally advanced dramatically at around about 2000. We moved from being predominantly a paper-based process for capturing data in clinical trials and moved towards using more electronic data capture. In particular, there was a shift with a couple of suppliers of EDC, which moved this dramatically forward by using web technology, Medidata being one of the first, which really changed the way industry was looking at EDC. And ironically, digital health, which is now probably front and foremost of most conversations that I have, either just about digital health as a whole, but in particular in relation to the clinical trials market, is actually interestingly talking about problems that we were talking about in digital within clinical trials about 10 years ago. So in some respects, the EDC marketplace is more mature than the actual electronic medical record space. But there are still considerable digital challenges, and I hope these will become slightly clearer. And just a few of them to set a sort of scene to this process is around kind of some of the obvious ones that we actually have here in the NHS, but are most definitely evident within the challenges of running trials across the continent. So what looks good on a CRO's desk in terms of a digital CRF for collecting clinical data, even in the NHS, looks a complete mess on my computer, mainly because they've designed the system using a 20-inch monitor somewhere, and I'm looking at it on a 15-inch monitor in the hospital, and so everything becomes very squashed. So design is really important, and consequently the access again. What may look like it runs really well on some super fast network within industry, by the time it gets to us deployed as the consumer of that EDC platform, that digital platform, is the fact that even here in the NHS, we're running 10 megabit per second network infrastructure. So it's very slow. So speed is another key aspect. But how do we also look at remote and risk-based monitoring and using digital tools to try and get to places? The pandemic has proved that clinical trials have halted whilst the lockdowns have occurred, and how can we use digital technology to replace what were more traditionally more in-person types of activity, monitoring being the most obvious one. And we've just actually shifted here all of our monitoring of our clinical trials to being online. But again, in the context of Africa, how do we actually service potentially running trials across multiple different countries, and how do we get the speed and agility that technically digital can bring to try and again promote more access, more sharing of resources or human resources in monitors to be able to get around quite a large number of countries. The other challenges that still remain are around data quality. Our electronic medical records are certainly here in the UK very poor in certain respects to the quality of the data. We're full of lots of 1 kilo high patients by 1 meter, because one tab 1 is pretty easy to press when you're using a digital system. But of course, we're still very reliant globally on an electronic patient record, which is actually an electronic paper record. So a lot of our digital source information is still paper but scanned. And how do we get high quality data from medical records through into the clinical trial space? I think the other thing to build upon is learning from the mistakes that we've made in Europe and North America, and actually to look to try and concentrate on, as I said earlier, the leapfrogging opportunity that we have across the continent. And from what I've seen, how we can actually learn from those mistakes elsewhere, improve on them, and actually accelerate the process of adopting digital. But to support digital capacity and the adoption, there are a number of challenges that we still need to consider in certain study locations and sites. I spend, very luckily in my role, I spend a lot of time working globally, all over the world in predominantly low to middle income settings or developing settings. And still most of my work is looking at infrastructure, from electric power to network connectivity and lastly security. And the capacity of that infrastructure to be there as required for running an effective clinical trial using digital tools is not just about making sure that we have power internet, but it's also about training and the capacity of training individuals to manage this stuff and look after it, and to make sure everything is running as we need it to be. But these challenges, I think, are something that we can certainly work with, and we're using adaptive technologies, which I'll touch on later, to try and overcome some of those challenges. But just to get to the foundations of digital requirements in clinical trials, and I'm probably trying to teach you all to sort of slightly suck eggs in some respects, but the 3 core things that really we need to be looking at is study management. So where, the process of setting up research, conducting it, closing it out, the harmonization of governance processes, that quality thing that's so important that Delva mentioned, and the access to documentation, the accessibility of it and the depth of it to make sure that it's easily accessible throughout the particular study. The data capture tools themselves, systems to collect clinical study information or laboratory information, and monitoring tools to be able to remotely, in some respects, monitor those studies. And then lastly, the randomization process, the ability to be able to randomize patients onto interventional studies and to look at the drug supply and logistics issues that come with that, and the digital tools to help us make sure that the correct stock is in the right places and the correct locations. So these are the three foundational bits of data management that digital platforms that we need to be able to successfully increase the amount of clinical trials that we're operating, that we want to operate. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was the digital intelligence. It's all very good in collecting lots and lots of information, particularly in that kind of site information about, what research is happening where, who's got the right facilities. That data is all very well and good in capturing it, but we need to actually act upon it and use that intelligence that we gain from that to be able to, in some respects, sell the sites as being available and suitable and able to run particular clinical trials, and how to manage that. And this mirrors a little bit some of the work that we've done here in the NHS with the National Institute for Health Research. And I'm really seeing an increase of countries globally and hospitals asking us how they can kind of steal some of those concepts and implement them locally to take the best things that we've done in the NIHR and trying to adapt them for local use, which is proving to be very fruitful. So these sort of 5 steps I lay out here is a kind of, we need to map sites. We need to obviously keep clear records of staff's experience and training. Where are our PIs? Where are the nursing staff? Where are the pharmacists who are going to help us run these studies? And to collect information about training and qualifications. As I said earlier, the drug supply management, what facilities do these sites have? What systems do they have in place to manage randomization? It's not just about randomizing a patient, it's about managing that drug supply process and the logistics. And then the site digital infrastructure. We've been running some projects in a number of countries where we've done quite an extensive amount of analysis of the kind of digital infrastructure. Do people have internet connectivity? How speedy is that internet connectivity? How does it operate? And does it fit the needs for what we want to ultimately deploy? And just to go back to that NIHR-like data management process here, that intelligence is built upon the networks that we've built here in the UK, and that I've been talking to Delva and other colleagues across Africa and internationally about how to build these coordinating centres to try and facilitate this kind of approach and to get that intelligence and to coordinate training and harmonisation. And that includes the digital side of that. So obviously, most of you will be reasonably familiar that we have the National Institute for Health Research in the UK, which has a coordinating centre, which then manages clinical research networks geographically across the country, of which under those individual clinical research networks are hospital sites and some of our clinical trials units or clinical trial centres who are sponsoring and doing the conduct of the trial. And that's managed, that's mirrored by an entire digital platform to support that. So there is a central portfolio management system which tells us nationally what trials are running, what type of trials are running, what diseases are those trials covering, and then these are mirrored to give us both regional and local overviews of what's happening. The UK historically was a paper-based system where everything was, from a governance perspective, correct. But from our ability to understand what we were doing, particularly in Southampton, from where I am, where we're on average running around about 1,800 clinical trials at any one time, knowing exactly whether these trials were fulfilling the requirements for our patients, whether we were sure that we had trials in the right places, and more importantly, as trials were beginning to come to an end, whether we were planning up front to make sure that we had the right trials to replace them. So the NIHR is underpinned by these different digital solutions. EDGE is the solution that ultimately controls that. EDGE actually was developed as part of the Cancer Research Network here in the UK about 21 years ago. And Southampton implemented a solution to try and mirror what you can see on the screen here, which is ultimately to have real-time research registers in some respects, whereby sponsors are lodging particular research projects into a central database. And our individual sites that are recruiting patients then join those research projects and collaborate within this central platform called EDGE to allow us to be able to be more effective and efficient in the way we run our trials, but also to make sure that non-study administrative tasks can be completed in a timely manner, so we can really get the intelligence about each individual project, but as I said earlier, about what we're doing as a hospital. And what this allows us is to also provide additional information through to our networks, our coordinating networks, our CRNs, the funders who are paying for the research, so they can see that the research is ongoing, how it's performing, but also to feed our governments with information about the performance of our research network and the investments that they've made. And then additionally, on top of that, to create a community that works within this platform, share information and share best practice. It's very easy to talk about working collaboratively, but sometimes we can look at best practice in another environment and then try and implement it in our own environment. But if this digital platform can help us do that, and that's something EDGE has been able to achieve very successfully, is an ability to share best practice, both through study setup, conduct and closure, so thus saving people time, but also harmonizing in some of the way that we actually undertake this. So just as an example, that platform is now used across 90% of all NHS infrastructure in the UK. It's also used at the government level from Belgium. It's being operated actually in a single site operating perspective with Delver at UCT, but other hospitals across South Africa are beginning to also be interested in adopting a platform to help them run their research more effectively. India, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, with other developing communities wanting to join the programme. So this coordinated effort to using digital for the study management and therefore, I guess, the balanced portfolio of research that we're looking for, and is managing currently about over 150,000 research projects with 35,000 users. I had an extra naught in there accidentally, and about 7 million patient records and millions of documents, so electronic study data files, making it easy and quick and accessible to both clinical and administrative staff to be able to do their tasks. And this infrastructure has taken a while to build, but it actually has allowed us here in the UK to get approval times for opening studies undertaken in 30 days, with a target of 70 days to recruit our first patient. And we're pretty much hitting that target constantly here now in the NHS.
Okay.
The next part of my story,
You're over time. Do you have much?
No, what I really wanted to talk about, though, was actually about the lay of the digital landscape at the moment, which is predominantly focused in areas of quite obvious concentration.
Okay.
And the global funding for cancer is less than 1% in clinical trial terms. But I'm going to leave you with this final part, which is around what we need to potentially do, which is create a peer network to support digital across these different parts, and ultimately to continue to collaborate as much as we possibly can around the digital landscape and the digital infrastructure to support clinical research across the continent. I'll leave it there with you, Delva.
Thank you so much, James, and we may come back to it in the panel. So thank you very much for that. I've already got a number of questions, but there you are. Let's move on rapidly to Professor Satish Gopal from the NCI and NIH. Satish, are you ready? You may begin.
Great, thanks so much, Delva. I'll assume that this is projecting correctly, but someone please speak up if that's not the case. So I'm, sorry, what was that?
It's all good.
Okay, so I'm Satish Gopal. I direct the Center for Global Health at the National Cancer Institute in the United States. I was asked to briefly offer some perspectives on clinical trials, which is something that we're thinking about fairly intensively. So I thought I would just make some general comments, which hopefully will be valuable for the subsequent discussion. So I thought I would just get the punchline out of the way at the beginning. So these are the key things that I would like to emphasize, again, in the way of general comments that might inform the ensuing conversation. So first, cancer clinical trials save lives in high-income countries. Second, cancer clinical trials in LMICs, including Africa, are unjustifiably few. Third, clinical trials in the US may not generalize well to Africa. Fourth, cancer clinical trials in Africa can inform cancer care worldwide. And finally, cancer clinical trials in Africa must be appropriately contextualized if they are indeed to save lives. And I'll try to give examples of each of these. So the first point is that cancer clinical trials in and of themselves are a life-saving intervention. And I think there's been recent data about this in the United States that's been presented and has attracted quite a lot of attention. This is an analysis presented at the European Society of Medical Oncology Congress that was picked up in a number of outlets, including the Cancer Letter last month. These authors did an analysis of all randomized phase 3 trials from the NCI-supported Adults National Clinical Trial Network groups between 1980 and the present that had significant findings for at least one clinical time-dependent outcome. And they sought to establish what the effect of these trials were at a population level. So they attributed gains in population life years by deriving trial-specific hazards and then estimating the area under the survival curve difference between standard and experimental arms, and then mapping this individual trial level benefit of the experimental treatment onto the US cancer population using National Cancer Registry and life table data. They also looked at the scientific impact of these studies assessed by Google Scholar. And in essence, they ended up analyzing 163 trials with more than 100,000 patients that represented 31% of all trials conducted by the NCTN during this period. The most common cancers were breast, gynecologic, lung, prostate. These trials were cited a mean of 64 citations per year per trial, which is remarkable. And of these 163 trials, 128 showed an overall survival benefit favoring the experimental arm. And so if this is then mapped to the US cancer population using these methods, that was estimated to have generated gains of 14 million life years to cancer patients. And I think there's been a really rich and interesting discussion that's followed the presentation of these data. You know, to what extent can clinical trial results be extrapolated onto the US population at a national level at large? That may overestimate the impact of these trials by assuming that they're uniformly taken up across the US. On the other hand, these authors disregarded studies that showed a substantial progression-free survival benefit that likely would have translated into an overall survival benefit. And so that may have underestimated the impact of these findings. But I think regardless, I think it's safe to say that this publicly funded effort to mount cancer clinical trials that address patient needs really does result in substantial life years gained at the individual patient level. And that's something that we as the NCI truly take tremendous pride in, being able to support these types of efforts. So to generate life years gained at the individual patient level, if we assume that this requires doing impactful clinical trials and then disseminating them appropriately, you know, to what extent is this happening in LMICs, including in Africa? And not surprising to this audience, that's happening quite infrequently. So this is a nice paper that I encourage you all to look at if you're not otherwise aware of it. But this is a systematic review of oncology RCTs published between 2014 and 2017. These authors looked at English language reports of phase 3 studies that were testing any cancer-directed therapy. And this is what they found. There were 694 cancer RCTs during this period. Of those, 636 were in high-income countries, 51 were in upper middle income countries, of which 42 were in China, 7 were in low middle income countries, of which 6 were in India, and 0 were in low income countries. These are the World Bank classifications, of course. So any scientist would tell you that if you have a biased sample, you get biased results, right? This is research 101. And so what are the implications of this? The implications of this are that the clinical trial data for cancer that we have generated is a poor match to global cancer burden. Because LMICs have such a hard time conducting RCTs, I think in some ways they're much more strategic and selective about the trials that they conduct. And these often result in more frequently identifying effective therapies with larger effect sizes. And then, when we don't support LMIC trials, then the LMIC trials become less interesting. And so it becomes this vicious cycle where there's likely significant publication bias against LMIC RCTs. And just to illustrate this quickly, so this is showing the poor match to global cancer burden. So shown at left are the top 10 cancers worldwide by mortality, and shown at right are the top 10 cancers by RCTs. And you can see that many of the frequently occurring cancers worldwide, particularly those that are common in LMICs like liver cancer, cervical cancer, are not well represented in the most frequently studied cancers in RCTs. This is illustrating that even though only 8% of clinical trials during this period were conducted in LMICs, these trials were more likely to meet their endpoint with statistical significance and had larger effect sizes as assessed by the hazard ratio for mortality. And then finally, this is demonstrating just the potential publication bias against LMIC RCTs. That is, even though it's arguably much more difficult to do studies in LMICs and they may be more likely to yield informative results, LMIC cancer RCTs are overwhelmingly published in lower impact journals, which are shown at the left, and higher impact journals, shown at the right, tend to be dominated by cancer RCTs that are done in high income countries. Again, none of this is surprising, but I think it's important background for the conversation that we're having today and that will follow. The next point is that clinical trials in the US may not generalize well to Africa. And I actually don't have a good cancer example for this. I have many hypothetical examples, but I like to use concrete examples wherever possible during talks. So if anyone has a good cancer example, I would love to hear it. I think partly why there isn't a good cancer example is because there's hardly any, practically no cancer clinical trials that have been done in Africa. So it's hard to find instances of a cancer therapy not working well in Africa that worked well in the US because they've almost never been studied. But the infectious disease literature is replete with examples of things that worked well in one setting and didn't generalize well to Africa. And this is just one example. So this is, at the left is shown a study of dexamethasone as adjunctive therapy for adults with bacterial meningitis done in Europe to reduce inflammation together with standard antibacterial therapy, which showed a halving, that is essentially a 50% reduction in mortality for patients who received adjunctive dexamethasone. This was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2002. At right, 5 years later, is essentially the same study done in Malawi. Again, dexamethasone given as an adjunctive therapy for adults with bacterial meningitis, and they found no mortality difference. Indeed, mortality was actually a little bit higher in the dexamethasone group, although not statistically significantly. And so, there's a variety of explanations for this. The pathogens for bacterial meningitis are likely different. There's much more HIV infection in this population in Malawi. But a priori, to me, I would have guessed that dexamethasone for bacterial meningitis would be much more likely to perform similarly between the Europe and Africa than, for example, R-CHOP for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which is in many respects a much more complicated medical intervention. There are many other examples from the infectious disease literature. Another good one is cotrimoxazole for children with HIV. US guidelines had long indicated that children who had immune restoration to a CD4 count above 200 could discontinue cotrimoxazole safely. When a randomized study was done in sub-Saharan Africa, it demonstrated that continuing cotrimoxazole had an overall survival benefit, because in that instance, you're not just preventing pneumocystis, but you're preventing malaria and many other bacterial infections in children with HIV infection, even after they have good HIV control and some degree of immune restoration. So, again, I would love a good cancer example if any of you have it, but I think the infectious disease literature and global health literature otherwise is littered with these examples of things that worked in a certain way in one setting and often worked in precisely the opposite way in another setting. But cancer clinical trials, when done in Africa, can inform cancer care worldwide. And again, here, there's not a number of cancer examples, given the scarcity with which clinical trials have been done in sub-Saharan Africa, but I did pick this one. This is a phase 3 randomized controlled trial that was done in sub-Saharan Africa. It was not included in that 2014 to 2017 review that I cited earlier, published in JAMA Oncology earlier this year, because this paper was published just last year. But this is a study conducted by the AIDS Malignancy Consortium. This is an NCI-supported cooperative clinical trials group that early in the HIV epidemic was formed to study cancers occurring in that population. That was a population that was experiencing very unusual types of cancer and were often excluded from the mainstream oncology community and certainly clinical trials. And so a dedicated group to study and evaluate best therapies for that population specifically was created by the NCI. Over the last decade or so, the AMC has recognized that the burden of HIV-associated malignancies is largely in sub-Saharan Africa, and has mounted, I think, a strong effort to recruit sites and investigators, many of whom are now leading protocols from sub-Saharan African academic institutions, many of whom are leaders within aortic, to lead studies that are responsive to the needs of patients with HIV-associated malignancies in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is just one example. This was a phase 3 randomized controlled trial published last year that enrolled patients with Kaposi sarcoma in multiple African countries plus Brazil. These investigators studied paclitaxel versus oral etoposide versus bleomycin vincristine, all with antiretroviral therapy, and found that paclitaxel was superior. And one of the things they found was they actually evaluated a novel paclitaxel dosing regimen, which was 100 milligrams per meter squared given 3 weekly, as opposed to the US FDA approved dose, which is 100 milligrams per meter squared given twice weekly. And in this study, these investigators found that this spaced out dosing appeared to preserve efficacy and reduce toxicity compared with published data from the US. And I have certainly spoken to oncologists in the United States who are treating Kaposi sarcoma patients who are aware of this data and have adjusted their dosing practice in the US as a result of findings from this paper. So again, I think it is true that cancer clinical trials in Africa can inform cancer care worldwide. And I think if we were to do more trials, we would have more lessons to learn for various settings. And finally, the final point I want to make is that cancer clinical trials in Africa have to be appropriately contextualized if they are indeed to save lives. So I think, doing studies that are not a good match for the needs of the community in a particular setting is not likely to have the kind of uptake that we have so enjoyed in the US and the NCTN that I alluded to in the first slide. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of examples here from colleagues in Malawi. This is work that's been led by Steve Kimani and Matt Painshab and many other Malawian colleagues who helped to initiate and complete a study of R-CHOP for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma that were really attempting to rigorously evaluate the safety, efficacy, cost effectiveness, and budget impact of this fairly complex medical intervention in the Malawi environment. I don't want to speak about this for too much time because we're running out of time. And also, Steve Kimani will actually be talking about the rationale, findings, and implications of this work in the lymphoma session tomorrow afternoon. And I don't want to steal away from that outstanding presentation, but happy to elaborate on some of the reasons why we thought this was an important set of studies to do in Malawi during the discussion if there's time. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks again for the opportunity. I just want to remind everyone that this is where you can find out more about our center and get in touch with us through our website, email, and Twitter as needed. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Satish. It was superb, and I can't agree with you more on many of your contextual issues that you raised. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to move us straight on to the panel, and let me introduce them. In addition to our two speakers, we have Professor Bello, who is the president of Aortic. He will be joining us. Julie Gralo from ASCO, Jennifer Dent from BVGH, and then we have our two speakers, and then we have two oncologists from Nigeria, Dr. Joseph and Dr. Alabi. Thank you all very much for joining the panel discussion. I'm sure you can all put your cameras on now and join in. And I'd like to ask if there are, first of all, if there are any questions or comments you wish to raise regarding the two talks we have just heard. I'm going to try and see if I can see everybody's. If I don't see a hand or something, please just Let me know, somebody. Any questions at all? Comments? Perhaps I can start off with one comment which I would like your review on, and that is the program called EDGE that James Batchelor spoke of in his presentation is becoming increasingly used outside of his well-known West areas. But I have proposed that all our clinical trials units that we set up in Africa use EDGE as the basis for managing their clinical trials units. And I wondered whether there was anybody out there who had a particular alternative that they felt that we should use, or whether there is a general consensus that that would be a good idea. And also, James, you might want to remind me about what the implications would be in terms of finances for the ACTC to bring that in.
So as you know, I mean, EDGE is being globally used predominantly because it's been designed internally within the health system, and therefore it meets very clearly that health system need, rather than what's been traditionally inbound technology coming from individual CROs to try and fill a gap in their knowledge. So EDGE is there to sort of replace 20 inbound systems with one system that's kind of owned and managed. I think the other advantages is around I mean, you talk about the financial model. The EDGE program has never been government funded, never grant funded, nothing like that at all, because ultimately a grant would have paid for it and then it would have stopped, and then we would have lost it. So what we've actually done is tried to build a very frugal subscription network for individual organizations to participate. And you know that our aim is actually to get more research happening rather than to get people to pay subscription fees, because I think that's more important. And it's a scaled environment which says, you know, a subscriber in the UK will pay more than a subscriber, say, for instance, in another country based on their GDP of research turnover. But actually, in some cases, it will cost nothing. The key thing is that people have access to a platform, and more importantly, they have access to the community. As I said earlier, there are 35,000 people who use EDGE, and we come together at least once a year to share so much information, not about EDGE, but about how we're conducting trials. And they share so much best practice, and your own team knows that, and they've participated in that process. So I think the financial model is probably one that is comfortable, and I think it's one that people can appreciate, adds value, but it's certainly not expensive, that's for sure.
Thank you very much. James, there is a really burning question. You spoke of power and connectivity.
Yeah.
And we all know Africa, those words don't necessarily gel well in Africa, and even South Africa, you know. So what has been your experience? How have you overcome some of these issues in some of the countries in Africa where your program is already up and running?
So we've been deploying a different type of technology, one that basically is not so power hungry. One of my slides I didn't quite get to was we've taken something that we use in nuclear power stations or in actually aircraft. They're very, very highly compact solid state servers, which can technically run off a 12-volt battery. And they actually serve the electronic medical record in some of our pilot work, but also can serve electronic data capture tools. So these things are sort of, you know, very small, require very little power. They produce their own Wi-Fi network to basically then allow people to connect to it, input data. And if there's no internet and no mains power, then it will just sit there quietly getting on with it. But when the power and the internet does come back on again, it can then sync that information back through into our services. So we've looked at building a completely new approach to it. And you're right, connectivity is one of those big things. There's 2G, there's 3G, there's some 4G-ish, I'll add the word ish, but we're actually also we're doing trials at the moment in using Starlink, for instance, for being able to operate in areas to use satellite communication rather than relying on localized networks. So I think there's plenty of opportunity to use different means of connectivity, to be power frugal as well as technology frugal. And in projects that we're doing in Ghana, we're actually using SMS messages for transmitting clinical information because it's very effective and very efficient with the 2G networks they've got. So I think we need to think differently. I think that's the key thing, different thinking.
So my action point from there is, one, to get your team to help us price up the relevant servers, infrastructure for these systems, and two, to ask your team to, whenever we if you like, install a clinical trials unit, that you're involved from day one and that you support. Would you be willing to support the installation?
Yeah, so I've actually, to help you, I've actually invested in South Africa to put some core data services in, both from a kind of data capture, clinical data capture tools, some data science tools, and some edge tools, so that they are kind of there and ready and waiting. That investment's already been made, which we made via another route for you. And secondly, it's about buddying. So we've done in New Zealand, for instance, of all places, we actually provided some tools and software to them, trained them, and then once they were up, we then transferred that ownership as well. So it goes back to that training and mentoring ship that I talked about. It's not just about saying, well, here's a thing, get on with it. It's here's a thing and we'll help you do it. And then once you're comfortable with it, you can then hand it over. And that's built on that model we have in the UK for our CTUs of mentoring between well-established CTUs with what those that were emerging. And we've taken that similar model forward in terms of what we're proposing to do.
That's excellent. That sounds perfect.
But just a reminder, Dr. Dewumo and Dr. Bello have their hands up.
Oh, thank you for telling me. I can't see them. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Delva. Okay. Let me go first. Thank you, Delva. I must really appreciate Dr. Gopal and James for the excellent presentation. They've captured quite a lot about Africa. But having said that, we have enormous challenges here. First, I'll talk about the digital health. So we have a lot of issues with health. So we don't have so many institutions that have this in place. And the issues of internet, Wi-Fi, power, so these are challenges. But I feel that this shouldn't deter us from being able to have clinical trials. For example, in my institution here in Lagos, we currently have 2 ongoing clinical trials. My institution is not fully digital yet, even though the cancer center is digital. So we have access to electronic data capturing. We have Wi-Fi 24/7. We have electricity 24/7, but not the entire hospital. So probably this is one of the reasons why we can say we can boast that we have 2 clinical trials ongoing in oncology clinical trials. But having said that, I want James to see if there are ways in which we can go around this, because just like he's mentioned, Dr. Gopal mentioned, that we need to save lives. And what works in the Western world may not naturally work for the Black man. So we need to save lives. And so because of this, we need to also find ways in which we can still make this work in our setting. After saying that, I also want to pose a question to Dr. Gopal, since he's from the National Cancer Institute. So one of the challenges we have is that we don't have funders. We have infrastructure, we have expertise to an extent. We have the patient load. We've got some things in place already, but we don't have funders. The 2 ongoing clinical trials we're privileged to be involved in because some people took interest in us and decided to help us out. and see if we can actually do it. And the two of them are going on successfully well. I can say that, courtesy of Professor Fumi Olopade and the Erasmus Medical Center. They've been very helpful. So if the National Cancer Institute has things in place, or better still, what role is the National Cancer Institute playing to ensure that we have more clinical trials in Africa? I know that basically they are...
Can you make it short? You are talking more than necessary, please, so that others can also participate. Thank you.
All right. So the question I'm asking is the role NCI is playing to help Africa to do more on clinical trials. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay. Satish?
yeah, sorry, do you want to go ahead or do you want me to
Yeah,
respond?
maybe I should just add my own so that it makes it quickly. I will be very brief. And thank you, James and Satish, for your amazing presentations. And I think if there's any take home that we need to have at this point from especially Satish's presentation is that clinical trials in Africa must be appropriately conceptualized. And I think that is the key, because fundamentally, we cannot say that we do not have a couple of clinical trials and so on and so forth. But because they are not coordinated, a lot of these things just go under the carpet, and we don't even recognize them. I do know that we have, not so coordinated clinical trials here and there. We'll be talking about clinical trials later today, and the role of the NCI, what they have done so far in supporting clinical trials in Africa and all that. But I think fundamentally, and what the IOTIC is trying to do is to develop funding capacity, to develop a framework that will be able to have center of excellence in clinical trial. And with that going forward, for me, I think it's the way to go, so that anybody that is interested in clinical trials in Sub-Saharan Africa can actually reach out to IOTICs, and then they can partner and move forward. I'll stop here. I don't want to talk too much.
Very much, Professor. Who was next?
Jennifer?
It was me, Delva. Thank you. And thank you for the presentations. My question to James was about the platform, because it looks like, and it sounds like, an amazing resource that's been adapted to Africa and some of the challenges of Africa. And I was curious whether there are any success stories, because it sounds like the platform is being used already in South Africa. So are there success stories that you're telling about the platform that would allow people to really see how it's helped and supported them?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to take the claim for singing the success of the implementation of EDGE with the team in South Africa, because actually it's been owned by them. It's been set up according to the way they work. One of the things about EDGE is it's not a piece of software that says you must do this in a particular way. It's there to mirror what you do and to support that. And I know that, for instance, Delva's colleagues would say that it's given them insight and access to information from sites that otherwise would have been trickling backwards and forward via bits of paper and bits and pieces. So their own success is a story I would prefer they tell. But I can tell you globally that of global things, that what we've actually managed to do with it is people have really been able to understand what research is going on. Dr. Bello talked about that, Professor Bello talked about that, in the sense that we need to know what research is going on. We need to make sure that we're not duplicating things. We need to target specific disease areas, and we need to utilize that information. And we've used that information in an example between Ghana and Kenya, between the universities and the health service and the ministries, to actually look at their data, to look at their clinical research portfolios, to look at their funding, and then actually to influence funders, to go back to the other question, to influence funders and say, you need to adapt your funding calls to meet these burdens, these clinical challenges that we're seeing. So I think the success story is one that is evolving, and I think it's increasing the visibility of trials. And if we were coordinated about that, we'd have real-time understanding of what research was going on in the continent, and we'd be able to be coordinated. That's the key thing. Is the success in the NHS has been about coordination, and in certain sites that's increased commercial funding in particular by 100% on some occasions. So it's increasing the amount of funding because it makes people more efficient, and that's what industry in particular is looking for, is efficiencies within sites too. So I think there's plenty to look forward to.
Thank you very much, James. That's, needless to say, hugely important. And the team here who have been developing and setting up EDGE will be the ones who will do it going forward with the ACTC business plan, supported by James's crew, who are always very, very helpful. Is there any particular question? Because otherwise I have a question.
Yes, so Delva, there's a question from the audience that is asking, is there any ASCO programs to train African oncologists to conduct clinical trials? Any ASCO program to train African oncologists to conduct clinical trials? I think that is to Julie.
Thank you for that question. Through our international affairs group, we do have an international clinical trials training workshop that a given country can apply for, and it can be done in a country, it can be done in a region. So that is one training opportunity. We also have some funding opportunities, particularly for junior investigators. We have a Young Investigator Award specifically for global oncology. We have an international innovation grant. So we also have some funding, and I'd be happy to talk with anyone about those opportunities.
Thank you very much, Julie. Anything more, James?
No, just that for now. And I think there was a question that was directed to Satish earlier.
Okay. Right. I have a question for everybody. And I want to warn you to stay with the question conceptually, not to get into legal and ethical issues, because I know they're big, but I also know they've been managed and dealt with because this is circumstances everywhere. But we all know that there is a dearth of pharmacogenetic studies in people of African descent. And this may be a key reason why we are seeing different responses, some even raised earlier by Satish, and different side effects. And everywhere you go, people raise the issue that amounts to the fact that populations will what's the word I'm looking for? Gone blank. It's been a long 4 days. Pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics will be different in different populations due to their genetic makeup. Now, I would like to propose that as part of the ACTC accredited clinical trials unit, we have consent forms when they come to do studies, be they pharma, be they medical device, be they investigator-led, that allows us to bank some samples. Now, remember I said don't go into the ethics. I know there's a huge ethical issue around this. It's been debated for years. And if we conceptually feel that this is a growth in the African genetic networking groups, we could produce a mass of data for use across many therapeutic areas. And I'm just wondering if I could have some perspective from the panel on this idea.
I think Julie's got her hand raised, Delva.
Julie, I can't see. Oh, Julie, yes, please go ahead, Julie, sorry.
Sure. So I think this is a great question, Delva. And as you know, at the recent
AAADV meeting, Accelerating Anti-Cancer Agent Development and Validation meeting held this past September, a meeting coordinated predominantly with the US FDA and industry. We actually had a session on clinical trials in low and middle resource settings with a focus on Africa, and the panel discussion related to increasing diversity, market access, and capacity in oncology registration trials. Is Africa the answer to get more diversity in our registration trials so that we can get at maybe some of these biologic differences? We don't do well enough in the US right now in that kind of diversity. So one of the conclusions, and there were many, and Aortic, thank you very much, was a strong participant in this session, was that conducting cancer clinical trials in Africa benefits not just Africa, and they're necessary, but it could actually help us in the US in improving our understanding of some of these maybe biologic, genetic, pharmacogenetic issues that span the races and ethnicities. And we need that kind of information for our FDA registration trials. So I hope I stuck to the answer, but yes, we concluded strongly that we should be including African sites in our broader FDA registration trials and the trials that lead up to registration to understand exactly the issues that you've discussed.
Okay, thank you very much. That's James, where are you? You seem to be shooting over the screen. There you are.
I was just going to add, I think one of the things I'm talking to a lot of countries about, particularly around their electronic medical records, but I think this is my view is there's a health system and there's a health research system. And at the moment, they're two different circles, and they need to become they need to be joined like a figure of 8, with the translation really happening in the middle and then feeding one another. But I think the other thing to think around is the kind of biobanking side of things in terms of research capacity. I'm getting more and more people saying, do I know sites anywhere in the world that have got high quality clinical registries of clinical data and biological samples to go with them? And I think that's an opportunity not to be forgotten as well, is to think about how we can try and build biorepositories and actually also biosignal repositories, because we're moving into a world where the dreaded AI word is being used every 5 minutes, but we do need to be thinking about biosignal information, the differences there, and I think that's where there's a great opportunity too.
Okay, thank you, James. Sorry, my hand was up because I was saying goodbye to Bello. Does anybody have, Prof. Bello, thank you. I saw your message. It's okay. Does anybody have any other questions or comments they would like to raise? I mean, I am very keen to push this idea of a biobank, but we first want to get the clinical trial sites up and running, but we don't want too much time to pass and too many opportunities to pass before. But I also see these biobanks as an extraordinary opportunity for local investigators, because we can develop even more, because obviously there are many there. We can provide opportunities to researchers who are already working in this area, and then provide opportunities for researchers to move into this area. And it is primarily their, it's their data, and it would be fantastic if we can develop a strong team across Africa, strong network of researchers who are providing this information to the rest of the world. Jennifer?
Thank you, Delva. I just wanted to highlight that BVGH has developed a platform across the continent, and we're now featuring more than 50 clinical trial sites with capabilities. This includes hyperlinks to published clinical trials by the site, and includes information about staffing, pharmacy, diagnostics, committees, policies, etc. And so there's a lot of detail. It's publicly available, and the purpose is to de-risk site selection and make it easier for national PI or biotechnology companies to easily identify sites that could be good sites to partner with to conduct cancer clinical trials or even other clinical trials across the continent. And it's also really to promote some of the PIs that are conducting clinical research on the continent. So I think that's one resource where, and I think we can key into other initiatives, the work, the system that James has built, other initiatives where we're featuring what different groups are doing in this space, just to make this information more easily available. We've also conducted some, mostly over the last 2 years, Delva, virtual training on clinical trials, but we have been conducting some in-person trials. And with the help and support of Takeda, we launched.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this very important session that was greatly executed by the facilitators and the panelists.